Hey guys, Jake from 8020 Automotive here. Today we're going to be talking about performance modifications for the Infiniti G37 and its VQ37VHR engine. I've previously done a video on Infiniti G35 modifications, and the G37 basically uses the same engine as the G35. It is just a slightly larger 3.7 liter, but it still uses that same naturally aspirated V6 configuration. In completely stock form, a good, healthy G37 will dyno somewhere around 270 to 280 wheel horsepower and 230 to 240 wheel torque, and that is based off of factory horsepower and torque numbers of 330 horsepower and 270 foot-pounds of torque at the crank. Now, the VQ37 engine, like the VQ35, is extremely strong. It can produce a ton of power without needing any block or internal upgrades. The stock internals are good for about 600 to 650 wheel horsepower, and the stock block is good for like 800 wheel horsepower. And so there is plenty of power potential in these VQ37 engines. The biggest downside from a starting point is just that this is a naturally aspirated engine, and so without getting into forced induction like turbochargers or superchargers, we're going to be pretty limited in terms of how much power we can make in naturally aspirated form. Today in this video, we're going to talk about basic bolt-on modifications that can get you anywhere from around 40 to 60 wheel horsepower, and then I will talk a little bit about considerations for going forced induction. So ultimately, with the modifications on this list, it's going to be, a few $1,000s, and you'll ultimately have a 310 to 340 wheel horsepower naturally aspirated Infiniti G37. So to go ahead and kick off that list of modifications, it really breaks down into three basic categories, and that's going to be intake, the exhaust system, and then tuning. So with the intake system, there are a lot of intakes on the market, a lot of them that also don't do anything from a power standpoint. If you're looking at short ram intakes, those aren't going to do anything. If anything, they might actually hurt you from a power standpoint. Or you also have drop-in filters. Drop-in filters have a little bit of power benefit, but ultimately the only intake modification that is worth it is going with a 3-inch long tube intake system. The 3-inch long tube system will actually provide good power gains out of it and is worthwhile from a cost to performance standpoint. First modification on our list is an intake just to help bring a little bit more air into the engine, and along with that, you're going to get a number of other benefits like improved throttle response. Don't go expecting a ton of horsepower from an intake, especially if it's on a completely stock engine, but once we go ahead and combine the intake with an exhaust system and then wrap everything together in a nice package with tuning, that's where an intake starts to increase in value. Now that we have more air coming into the engine, it's important to make sure that air efficiently gets out of the engine, and that brings us to exhaust upgrades. But of course, there are essentially three different sections of the exhaust that it's worthwhile to talk about. We've got the headers all the way up attached to the engine. From there, we have the catalytic converters, and then behind that, we have the catback portion of the exhaust system. And so when it comes to exhaust upgrades, we've got a lot of different routes that we can go here. I will start by saying that on the G37 and the VQ37, the best exhaust upgrade is going to be going ahead and replacing the catalytic converter portion of the exhaust system with test pipes. There is a lot of debate as to whether headers are worth it or not, but the majority of the restriction lies within the catalytic converters. That's where we're going to see the biggest power gains throughout the exhaust system of a G37. So if you don't want to delete the catalytic converters for emissions reasons, you can go with high flow catalytic converters. Those are going to be a little bit more expensive, and they're not going to offer quite the same performance as you'll see with test pipes, but of course, it's at the trade-off of emissions. And then a catback exhaust system, the VQ37s actually respond quite well to catback exhausts. And so this is one of the few cars where doing a catback exhaust actually makes sense on it. So then that brings us all back to the start of it with headers. Are headers worth it? Are headers not worth it? Ultimately, headers are going to be somewhere around $600 to get a good set of them. You can get a set of long tube headers that have the test pipes integrated into the headers, and those I think are probably around $1,500. Ultimately here, the big question is, what's your budget and what are you willing to spend. If you're just upgrading with high flow catalytic converters, then doing headers probably doesn't make sense, because that extra bit of airflow you'll get from upgraded headers is ultimately then just going to get restricted by the catalytic converters that are still there. So headers are something that if you're really trying to maximize your naturally aspirated performance, it's a good thing to do. But if you aren't looking to squeeze every ounce of horsepower out of this engine, then it's probably something that you can go ahead and ignore if you're going to go ahead and do the test pipes in the catback portion of the exhaust system. So test pipes and catback are going to provide you the biggest gains. The headers, if you want to do them, you can, but probably not quite worth it just from a cost to performance standpoint. The third modification to kind of wrap everything together is going to be tuning. The best route here is doing custom tuning with something like the UpRev or the ECU Tech. This is really just going to fully optimize the engine and optimize it for the intake and exhaust modifications that we've done. This really is the final piece to kind of package everything together and to give you somewhere around that 40 to 60 wheel horsepower power gains, depending on how your tuning goes and what route you choose to go with the exhaust system. That's really it for my list of basic bolt-on modifications for the G37. But like I said, we'll go ahead and discuss a few other things just for anyone that's looking to really take performance to the next level. So of course, to really make serious power, we are talking about forced induction. There is both supercharging and turbocharging for the VQ37 engine. Which one you want to go with ultimately depends on what your goals are, what you want your power band to look like, and what your budget is. But all in, regardless of which forced induction route you choose, the main thing to mention here is just that to get a proper turbo or supercharger kit and all of the supporting modifications that you need, you're going to be looking at a $10,000 plus budget to do it with a quality setup. If you want to throw some eBay parts on there or really piece together a kit, you can probably do it a little bit more cost effectively, but ultimately, you're looking at, a 5-digit price point to go ahead and add forced induction to these engines. It is a pretty steep kind of cost to take on to go ahead and make those big power levels. But the good news is these engines can handle a lot. With a $10,000 or $12,000 budget, you can actually get really good power out of these things. Granted, not quite the same power levels that you could get on a turbocharged or twin turbocharged engine with just some basic bolt-ons and a tuner. So ultimately, that's the main consideration from a forced induction standpoint, is just the budget on it. And then in naturally aspirated form, there are a few other things that you can do. There are camshaft upgrades. A camshaft is probably going to run you about $1,000, not including install, which obviously is a little bit more complex of an install. It's not quite a bolt-on part. And from a performance standpoint, you're probably going to get about 10 wheel horsepower and 30 wheel torque from a stage 1 camshaft. And so you are going to get good torque gains on it, not a ton of horsepower gains. But at some point after that, you start to lose just the daily drivability. And so camshafts are a good thing. You can actually get some pretty good torque gains out of them, just since the VQ37 is a little bit low on torque from the factory. But again, it's $1,000 plus install upgrade. And then from there, there's of course a number of other things we can do if we want to get more advanced, such as porting the intake manifold and getting an upgraded intake plenum. Those are, two more things that are probably going to run you $1,000. You're not going to see massive gains out of any of them, but if you're trying to maximize naturally aspirated performance, those are two things to look into as well. But all in all, if you're going to do all of these modifications, a camshaft, port out the intake manifold and do all these other things, you start getting to a point where it's like, well, do I just go for, the full $10,000 budget to throw forced induction on one of these? And so ultimately, you get to a certain point where you're spending so much money on these naturally aspirated mods for, squeezing an extra 5-wheel horsepower out of everything, where if you throw in a couple extra $1,000, you can build a pretty serious powered G37. So anyways, guys, that covers it for my video. Ultimately, these are really strong engines. They're great. They just require a lot of money to make serious power out of. But if you have the budget to do it, these engines can handle a really good amount of power without needing truly serious internal or block modifications. If you appreciate this video, please click the like button, subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for all the future content we have.